A racist police officer unjustly attacked and arrested a black woman standing outside a luxury store. But when he realized the woman he had just assaulted was the mayor, he was left in utter shock. Jane Fonda stood under the dim streetlight, trying to maintain her composure in the evening chill. She adjusted her blazer, feeling the gentle breeze, while the waiting time stretched endlessly. The upscale store had long since closed, and the darkened windows reflected the lonely street. She checked her phone, showing impatience at Marcus's delay. Suddenly, she heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind. A white police officer, hand resting on his belt, came with a suspicious demeanor. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he asked. Jane tried to stay calm. "I'm waiting for someone." The officer showed no signs of easing his suspicion and continued, "Waiting for someone? Out here at this hour? Standing in front of a closed store?" Feeling anger rising, but trying to hold it back, Jane replied, "My car is running late." The officer smirked coldly. "Standing here in that outfit? Is something special going on?" She asserted, "I'm just waiting for my car." The officer's presence grew heavier as he stepped closer, saying, "You don't belong here. Standing alone at night. You're not planning anything shady, are you?" Jane took a deep breath. "There's nothing like that. I'm just waiting for my car." The officer demanded her ID. Jane felt pressured. "I don't need to show you my ID when I haven't done anything wrong." The officer frowned. "When I ask, you have to provide your ID." Frustration mounted, and Jane struggled to keep her voice calm. "I'm waiting for my car. That should be reason enough." He shrugged. "You don't get to decide that." "We'll see about that. You're not going anywhere until I say so," the officer said, his tone threatening. Jane suppressed her anger. "There's no reason to make this a bigger issue. I'm just waiting for my car." The situation became tense. "You seem quite confident about your rights," the officer said. "But you shouldn't be standing here at this hour." Jane felt she was being accused solely because of her skin color. She knew that the situation could escalate if she wasn't careful, but she also couldn't allow herself to be disrespected. The confrontation turned into a power struggle. Moments passed, and Jane felt trapped in an absurd situation. To avoid facing unnecessary consequences, she needed to remain calm and not let her anger explode. However, with the officer's disrespect, Jane understood she couldn't accept this. In the cold, quiet night of the empty street, the yellow streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Jane Fonda stood silently, feeling the tension hanging thick in the air around her. The police officer stood facing her, his face full of suspicion, eyes steely. His hand rested firmly on his belt, where his handcuffs and flashlight hung, as if he were waiting for a reason to act. "I'll be watching you," the officer said, his voice carrying a threat. Jane didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained steady, meeting the officer's gaze with calm but unwavering determination. She didn't need to say anything more at that moment, because they both knew this situation wasn't over yet. The air between them felt charged, as if a single spark could set everything off. Jane stood still, her body tense and ready, while the officer continued to watch her with a scrutinizing gaze. Time dragged on, and the arrival of Marcus, Jane's assistant, seemed like a distant hope. "As I said before," Jane spoke up, her voice calm, but unable to hide the growing frustration. "I'm just waiting for my assistant. There's no reason for this harassment." The officer took another step, his eyes cold. "I don't care what you've said," he replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "There's something about you that makes me uneasy." Jane clenched her fists, but kept her hands at her sides. "What about me makes you uneasy?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Is it that I'm standing here in a suit? Or is it that you think I don't belong here?" The officer's eyes flashed with anger. "Watch your tone. I ask the questions, not you." Jane's heart pounded harder, but she tried to keep her composure. "You've been questioning me for 10 minutes now. If I were doing something wrong, you would have found out by now." The officer gave a sinister smile, his face twisted in the dim light. "Oh, I've found out plenty. People like you always think they're smart and won't get caught. But I won't let you get away that easily. You think I don't see what's happening here? Lurking around? Looking for a chance to break in?" Jane couldn't hold back her anger. "Lurking? That's what you think? I'm just waiting for my assistant, that's it. You're the one harassing me, looking for any reason to escalate this." The smile disappeared from the officer's face, replaced by a sharp glare. "Harassing you? I'm doing my job, keeping troublemakers like you out of places where they don't belong." Jane took another step, her voice as cold as the night air. "Troublemakers like me? What exactly are you implying with that?" The officer's voice rose, his tone growing louder. "You know exactly what I mean. You stand there, thinking you're smart, but I've seen your type before. A suit doesn't change who you are." Jane's heart raced, her anger flaring. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," the officer sneered. "You're just another person who thinks they can talk their way out of trouble. But not with me." Jane took a deep breath, trying to maintain her calm. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're the one creating trouble." The officer's eyes narrowed, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. "You're getting real close to crossing the line." Jane didn't flinch, her voice sharp in response. "And what line is that? The one where I don't let you harass me just for standing on a public sidewalk?" The officer gripped his handcuffs tighter, his face tense with anger. "You think you're smart, don't you? Do you think you can talk back to me? I'm the one in charge here, not you." Jane felt her blood boil, but she stood firm. "Power doesn't give you the right to treat people unfairly." The officer stepped closer, now only a few centimeters from Jane. "I don't need a reason if I feel threatened. And right now, I don't like the way you're talking to me." Jane understood that the situation was spiraling out of control, the officer's anger flaring with every word, but she wouldn't back down. "Not this time. You feel threatened? I'm standing here unarmed, just waiting for a ride, and it's you who's threatening me. That's not how things are supposed to work." The officer's jaw clenched, his hand hovering near the handcuffs. "I'll decide how things work. You're done talking." Jane squared her shoulders, facing the officer directly. "I'm not done until you stop treating me like a criminal." Without another word, the officer angrily grabbed the handcuffs. "That's enough. You're under arrest." Jane didn't resist, but her eyes held firm, sending a strong message. The truth would eventually come to light. The night was quiet, streetlights illuminating the raindrops still lingering on the pavement. Jane Fonda had just stepped out of a luxury store when she was confronted by an officer. The officer's face was full of suspicion, and the atmosphere quickly grew tense. Jane tried to stay calm, but things took a turn for the worse when the officer advanced with handcuffs. Jane stepped back, raising her hands to show cooperation. "You have no right to do this." "I've done nothing wrong," Jane said tensely. However, the officer ignored her and quickly seized Jane's arm. "Don't even think about resisting," he said coldly. Anger simmered inside Jane, but she held it in. "I'm not resisting, but you can't arrest me without reason," she said firmly. The officer responded with more force, tightening his grip and pulling Jane forward. "You think you're special? Think again." Jane tried to pull her arm back, but her calm began to fade. "Get your hands off me," she growled. The officer shoved Jane into the window, causing her shoulder to painfully slam against the glass. "I told you not to touch me." Jane reacted sharply, but fear coursed through her. The officer leaned in close, his breath hot. "You're resisting, and I don't like that." Jane's breath became rapid, gasping as she tried to maintain distance. "I'm not resisting. You're the one making this worse." But the officer's eyes only showed defiance, his fingers tightening as he shoved Jane into the window again. "Enough. I'm out of patience with you." Before Jane could respond, the officer threw a hard punch to her jaw, the impact like thunder, leaving Jane stunned. She stumbled back, her head slamming against the glass, and for a moment the world around her seemed to spin, images blurring. Jane struggled to regain her balance, raising a hand to her face to ease the pain. A sharp ache radiated from her jaw down her neck, each throb echoing in her mind. The officer stared at Jane, a cold smile forming on his lips. "You just love causing trouble," he said, his voice low and triumphant. He grabbed Jane again, slamming her face first into the window, pressing her down as if to emphasize his power. "Now you're going to learn your lesson." Jane groaned as her chest was forced against the cold glass, feeling the pain from her arm twisted behind her back. She struggled to find her voice amidst the pain, her words fractured. "You have no right to do this," the officer hissed into Jane's ear, his gaze full of menace. "Just try me." The sound of handcuffs clicking filled the air, and moments later, the cold metal bit into Jane's wrists. She winced as the cuffs dug into her skin, while the officer pushed her toward the patrol car. Jane Fonda sank, her cheek pressed against the cold window, pain and shock flooding her mind. She tried to turn, but the weight of the officer pinned her down, her breath mingling with the cold night air. "Get down!" the officer commanded, pulling Jane away from the window and slamming her onto the asphalt. Jane stumbled, her knee hitting the ground, causing her to gasp in pain. The punch earlier still left her, cheek numb, her head spinning. Everything had happened so fast. She couldn't comprehend how it had come to this. She knew she was innocent, but now she lay handcuffed, pinned to the ground, attacked by those meant to protect her. The officer stood above her, seething with anger, his chest heaving. "Next time, you'll think twice before resisting arrest," the officer sneered. Jane looked up, her vision blurry and her body aching, but her voice remained strong. "You'll regret this." The officer smirked, his eyes full of contempt. "No, I don't think so. You'll regret it more." The cold night wind swept through, but Jane knew this was just the beginning. This wouldn't end so easily. The handcuffs tightened as the officer shoved Jane toward the patrol car. Her body ached from the confrontation. But beneath the pain and rising anger, a strange calm settled over her. Jane knew something the officer didn't, and it was the key to this situation. The officer, still wearing his smug expression, yanked open the back door with a rough gesture. "Get in the car. I warned you not to resist." But Jane didn't rush. She took a deep breath, stood tall, and with a slight smirk, she said, "Before you throw me in, why don't you check my ID first?" The officer paused, his hand still on the open car door, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jane kept that same smile, now tinged with a hint of confidence. "You heard me. Check my ID. My wallet is in my coat pocket." The officer hesitated, suspicion flashing across his eyes as if wondering whether this was a trap. "You had your chance to show ID. Now you want to cooperate?" Jane met his gaze steadily, her voice calm, but her confidence growing. "Check it. You'll want to know who you just handcuffed before the situation gets worse for you." The officer's confidence wavered, but he still tried to maintain authority. "All right, let's see what you're trying to pull," he muttered, reaching into Jane's pocket and pulling out the wallet. He flipped it open impatiently, pulling out a card. First, he squinted at the ID, then suddenly, his expression shifted. His face paled, the smugness draining away, replaced by clear panic. The officer's eyes darted from the ID to Jane's face, his shock unmistakable. You're... "That's right," Jane replied, her voice still calm and measured, but now laced with a cold edge. "I'm the mayor of this city." The officer stared at the ID in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. He hoped the information would somehow change, but it didn't. The realization hit him like a punch to his pride. He had just attacked and arrested the mayor of the city. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the handcuffs, trying to undo them, as if that could erase his mistake. The aggression from earlier had vanished, replaced by sheer fear. "Ma'am, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Jane Fonda looked at the officer, her gaze sharp and cold. "You didn't realize because you let your prejudice guide you," she said, her voice commanding. "You assumed that because I'm a black woman in this area, I must be dangerous? Do you know what your actions will lead to?" The officer flushed with shame, hurriedly unlocking the handcuffs, his voice shaky. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean..." Jane cut him off, her tone harsh. You didn't mean to punch me. You didn't mean to use force and shove me into a patrol car like a criminal. No, you acted on the instincts you've nurtured for years. That's what you did." The officer searched for words, stammering. "Ma'am, I thought you were a threat. Jane took another step forward, her eyes never leaving the officer who was now backing away. "You thought? That's the problem. You didn't think. You saw and decided. And now you're facing the consequences of your actions." The officer stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry. I truly didn't mean for it to go this far." Jane tilted her head, her voice dropping, but with an unyielding firmness. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? That's exactly what happens when you let your bias control you. You're supposed to protect and serve, but instead you abused your power to attack those you see as different." The officer took a deep breath, trying to hold himself together, but his entire demeanor radiated panic. "I made a mistake." Jane shook her head, her voice sharp as a blade. "A mistake? Do you think an apology is enough? Do you think calling it a mistake will make me forgive you?" The officer lowered his gaze, unable to meet Jane's eyes, realizing there was no way out. Jane watched him for a moment, then sighed and stepped back. "Give me your badge number, right now." The officer, flustered, hurriedly gave his badge number, his voice trembling as he recited each digit. Jane pulled out her phone, carefully noting it down. She gave the officer one last look, her eyes filled with determination and challenge. "You'll be hearing from me," Jane said firmly, leaving no doubt that this incident wouldn't be forgotten. With that, Jane turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing there, trapped in a mix of regret and fear. Jane walked down the street, the dim streetlights casting a thoughtful glow over her figure. She knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a larger problem: racism and abuse of power deeply rooted within the police force. And as Jane continued down the street, she knew that change was coming. A change she would fight for, no matter the obstacles ahead. Jane Fonda walked down the street with a heavy heart, her mind swirling with unresolved thoughts. The night before, she had gone through a terrible experience. While standing on a street in the wealthy part of the city, she was confronted by a police officer without any clear reason. Jane recalled the moment when the officer realized he had made a serious mistake after checking her ID. The officer's stunned, hesitant expression upon discovering that he had just assaulted the mayor, a person he was supposed to protect, made the situation deeply ironic. But Jane didn't care about the fleeting regret. What occupied her mind now was how to ensure that this officer, and others like him, would never again abuse their power to oppress others. Upon arriving home, Jane immediately called Marcus, her close friend and trusted aide at City Hall. Her voice was low and urgent. "Marcus, get to City Hall right away. I need to talk to you about something extremely serious." Marcus, surprised by the urgency in Jane's voice, didn't ask further questions. He knew that when Jane called, it wasn't a small matter. Less than 30 minutes later, Marcus arrived at Jane's office. As he entered, he saw his friend standing by the window, watching the traffic below. Jane's face was tense, filled with determination. "What happened, Jane? You're worrying me," Marcus asked, his voice full of concern. Jane turned, her gaze sharp. "Last night, I was attacked by a police officer," she said, trying to remain calm but unable to hide her anger. "He assumed I didn't belong in that area, and before I could say anything, he attacked and handcuffed me. He didn't know who I was." Marcus was shocked. "You're saying you were attacked? But why? And why hasn't anyone spoken up?" he asked, his face full of surprise. Jane nodded, her voice growing firm. "Yes, I was humiliated on the street by someone who was supposed to protect me. But when he realized I was the mayor, his entire demeanor changed. Fear flooded his eyes, but I didn't care. I won't let this slide." Marcus looked Jane in the eyes, trying to understand his friend's thoughts. "So, what do we do? What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked, ready to help. Jane looked at Marcus, her eyes reflecting a steely determination. "First, I'm going to file a formal complaint against that officer. We'll make sure he faces the consequences. Then, I want a meeting with the police chief. This isn't just a personal matter. It's a systemic issue. Marcus, we have to do something to change this." Marcus nodded in agreement, understanding that this wasn't just about protecting Jane's dignity, but an opportunity to address a larger issue of discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. "I'll handle the complaint process. As for the meeting with the chief, I'll arrange it by tomorrow," Marcus said. "But are you sure you want to push this hard? There will be a lot of pressure from the police side." Jane clenched her fists, her eyes resolute. "This isn't the first time I've faced discrimination, Marcus. But this time, I can't let it go. It's become too personal, not just for me, but for everyone else like me. People who don't have the power to protect themselves. If we don't stand up, this will keep happening, over and over again." Marcus could feel the determination in Jane's voice. He stepped closer, placing a hand on Jane's shoulder, his voice full of support. "I'll stand with you, Jane. We'll face whatever resistance they throw at us. I won't let you fight this alone." Jane looked at Marcus, relieved to have such a reliable ally. "Thank you, Marcus. We'll do this the right way, and we won't back down." The next morning, as Jane walked into City Hall, she felt a new strength surge within her. The physical pain from the attack still lingered, but inside, her anger and sense of injustice had transformed into a burning resolve. She walked into her office and saw that Marcus was already prepared with their plan of action. "We've got everything ready. The meeting with the police chief is scheduled for this afternoon. I've also submitted the complaint to their office," Marcus reported quickly. Jane nodded, taking a deep breath. "It's time to act, Marcus. This time, we won't just change one person, but an entire system." The two exchanged a glance, fully aware that what they were about to do went beyond addressing a single incident. This was a bigger battle, an effort to fundamentally change the way the police system operated. Jane stepped out of the room, the weight on her shoulders now transformed into an indescribable strength. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, But this time, she wouldn't walk it alone. The next morning, Jane Fonda walked into the police headquarters with a determined stride, though her jaw still ached from the punch the previous night. The early sunlight filtered through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the cold tiles. Marcus followed closely, his face mirroring the same resolve. They walked straight to the reception desk, where a busy officer was sorting through paperwork. He looked up and immediately recognized Jane. "I need to see Chief Donald," Jane said, her voice calm but firm. The officer hesitated, his eyes flickering to the bruise on Jane's jaw. Yes, ma'am. I'll inform him right away." He quickly picked up the phone, relaying the message to the chief's office. A few moments later, Chief Donald emerged from the back office. He was a tall man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and an air of authority. When his eyes landed on Jane's bruised face, his brow furrowed, his expression growing tense. "Ms. Fonda," Donald said, extending his hand politely, but Jane didn't reciprocate. "Please, come into my office. We need to discuss last night's events." Without waiting for a response, Donald turned and led both Jane and Marcus down a long hallway, his steps heavy with authority. They entered Donald's office, and the door closed behind them, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Donald gestured for Jane and Marcus to sit in the chairs opposite his desk, but Jane remained standing, her eyes fixed on the chief. "I heard there was an incident last night," Donald began, his tone neutral but cautious. "An incident?" Jane scoffed, her voice cold. "One of your officers assaulted me and harassed me for simply standing on the sidewalk. You call that an incident?" Donald paused for a moment, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Fonda. We will conduct a thorough investigation into this and handle it according to protocol." Just as Donald finished speaking, the door opened and Officer Christian Pulisic, the same officer who had attacked Jane, walked in. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. He glanced at Jane before looking away, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. Donald sat behind his desk, his stern gaze directed at the young officer. "Officer Pulisic," he said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from Jane. "We need to be clear about what happened." Christian Pulisic slowly sat down, his body stiff. The arrogance he had displayed the night before had vanished, replaced by visible anxiety. He glanced briefly at Chief Donald, then quickly looked away when his gaze met Jane's, who was still standing, her eyes burning with determination. Jane stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. "Officer Pulisic, what were you thinking last night when you ignored everything I said, when you let the situation spiral out of control?" Her voice was filled with a quiet but intense fury, forcing Christian to confront the truth of his actions. Christian shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting between Jane and Donald. I didn't know who you were. I thought," Jane interrupted him sharply. "You thought what?" she asked coldly. "You thought you had the right to treat me like a criminal, because I didn't fit your image of who belongs in that part of town at night. You didn't care about the truth. And when I pointed that out, you responded with violence." Donald turned to Christian, his face hardened. "Officer Pulisic, this behavior is completely unacceptable. Why didn't you try to de-escalate the situation instead of making it worse?" Christian swallowed, feeling trapped between the weight of his own actions and the scrutiny from his superiors. I made a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought she was—" "You didn't think," Jane cut in, her voice rising slightly. "You acted based on your prejudice. You let your bias control your actions, and instead of listening to me, you chose to abuse your power." Christian lowered his head, unable to meet Jane's gaze. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice fading with shame. Jane's demeanor remained firm and unrelenting. "Your apology doesn't change what happened," she said sharply. "This isn't just about me. You betrayed your oath to serve and protect. What you did last night wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on every person who has ever been treated unfairly by someone in your position." Donald nodded, his tone stern. "Officer Pulisic, your actions have crossed a line. You will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. There are consequences for this, and they will be serious." Christian's face fell as he realized the gravity of his situation. He started to speak, but Donald's cold stare silenced him. He glanced at Jane, his face filled with regret. But there was no undoing what had been done. Jane turned to Chief Donald, her tone sharp, yet calm. This isn't just about one officer, Chief. There is a culture in your department that allows things like this to happen. It's a culture of prejudice. A culture that doesn't see people like me as equals. This needs to change, and it needs to happen now. Chief Donald's face tightened momentarily, but he nodded, acknowledging the truth in Jane's words. You're right. There are systemic issues that need to be addressed. I will take immediate action to review our department's practices. Jane crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. Immediate action isn't enough. This incident will not be swept under the rug. I expect a public, transparent investigation. The people of this city need to know that their police force is being held accountable. Donald hesitated for a moment, but then nodded again. We will ensure that happens. Jane stepped closer to Donald's desk, her voice lowering but filled with resolve. This isn't just an incident, Chief. This is an opportunity to make real changes. If this department doesn't start taking responsibility for its actions, I will make sure the public knows exactly what's happening behind closed doors. The tension in the room was palpable. After a long pause, Donald finally spoke, his voice quieter, but no less serious. I understand. Jane turned to look at Christian one last time, her voice steady but firm. You thought you could get away with what you did because you believed you had power. But you've learned today that power doesn't mean you're above accountability. Christian remained silent, not daring to look up at Jane. The regret and fear on his face said it all. Things had gone too far to be fixed with apologies. Without another word, Jane turned and walked out of the office, with Marcus following closely behind. The air outside felt lighter, but Jane knew the fight for justice and reform had only just begun. This was far from over, but she was ready for the battles ahead. As Jane Fonda and Marcus stepped outside the police headquarters, the crisp morning air hit them. Jane's jaw still throbbed from the assault, but her mind was already focused on the next steps. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult process. The battle for justice wasn't going to be won in a single day, and she was prepared for that. Marcus, walking beside her, broke the silence. Jane, we need to be strategic about how we handle this. The police department won't take this lightly. They'll try to deflect, minimize what happened. Jane nodded. I know, but I won't let them hide behind internal investigations or bureaucracy. This has to be public. People need to see that this is more than just one officer. It's about the whole system. As they arrived at City Hall, Jane's phone buzzed. It was a message from a local reporter, asking for a comment on the incident. The news was already starting to spread. Jane turned to Marcus, her expression serious. We need to get ahead of this story. Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I'm not letting them control the narrative. Marcus nodded. I'll make the arrangements. This could get messy, but if we frame it right, we can bring public attention to the larger issue. Jane's gaze hardened. Good. We need the public on our side. This isn't just my fight. It's a fight for everyone who's been mistreated by a system that protects those in power. That afternoon, a crowd of reporters gathered outside City Hall, waiting for Jane's announcement. Marcus stood beside her, ready for this important moment. When Jane stepped up to the podium, her face was calm but resolute. She began, Last night, I was attacked and harassed by a member of our city's police force. I was simply standing on a public sidewalk, but an officer chose to treat me like a criminal because of my appearance. The crowd listened attentively, and Jane continued, her voice growing stronger. This incident reflects a larger issue, bias that exists within our police force. That officer did not see me as a human being entitled to presence. She paused, letting her words sink into the minds of the listeners. I call for a public, thorough investigation and real reforms in the police force. The reporters began shouting questions, but Jane raised her hand to stop them. This is not just my fight. This is the fight of everyone in this city. We need a police force that protects all of us. After finishing, Jane stepped down from the podium, leaving the reporters in chaos. Back in the office, Marcus praised her, but Jane remained serious, realizing this was only the beginning of the challenges ahead. She knew that if they didn't push for change now, this would continue to happen to those without the power to speak up. In the following days, Jane's story exploded, attracting the attention of the media and the public. Many called for police reform, organizing protests to demand transparency and accountability. Public pressure intensified, turning the city into the focal point of the national discussion about police brutality and systemic racism. However, the police union was not sitting idle. They defended the officer, claiming he was merely following procedures, and accused Jane of exploiting the situation for political gain. One morning, Marcus anxiously informed Jane about the strong counterattack from the union. Jane asserted, "I'm not against the police. I'm against the abuse of power. If they can't see the difference, that's precisely why this fight is necessary." Marcus reminded her to prepare for dirty attacks. Nevertheless, Jane was determined not to back down. In the following weeks, the city witnessed heated debates and protests. Jane steadfastly called for reform, and more people rallied behind her. Finally, the public hearing day arrived, and Jane prepared to speak before the city council, with the entire city watching. She stepped into the council chamber, the eyes of the city upon her. As she took her seat at the front of the room, she glanced around at the faces of the council members, the media, and the community leaders who had come to support her. The atmosphere was tense, but Jane was calm. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her seat, her voice steady but filled with passion. "Members of the council, today I am not just speaking as the mayor. I am speaking as a person who has been directly affected by the systemic issues in our police force. What happened to me could have happened to anyone, and it has happened to countless others who didn't have the power to fight back," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We need real reforms, reforms that ensure accountability, transparency, and justice. The people of this city deserve better. We cannot allow those sworn to protect us to continue abusing their power. We need a police force that serves all of us, not just a select few." As Jane spoke, the room was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. When she finished, the chamber erupted into applause, the public's support clear and overwhelming. The hearing was just the beginning, but Jane realized that the tide had shifted. With public support and a clear mission, she sparked a powerful movement. Though the road ahead would be challenging, Jane Fonda was ready. After the hearing, the momentum for reform continued to spread. Her inspiring speech echoed everywhere, sparking discussions from affluent neighborhoods to struggling communities. Protests demanding police reform grew more intense, calling for transparency and accountability from the force. However, Jane understood the difficulties that lay ahead. The police union would not easily accept change. Behind closed doors, they organized a counterattack, rallying support from within and trying to turn public opinion against her. The battle lines were now clearer than ever. One afternoon, Marcus came into Jane's office, his face serious. "Jane, we've received word that the union is preparing a major pushback. They're holding a press conference tomorrow, claiming that your reforms will put public safety at risk. They're going all out to undermine you." Jane wasn't surprised. "Let them try. This isn't about safety. It's about protecting their interests. We're not backing down." Marcus nodded, but looked worried. "The union is powerful, Jane. They have influence, and they'll play dirty if they need to. We need to be prepared for anything." Jane's gaze hardened. "I know, but we have something more powerful on our side. The truth. The public has seen what's going on, and they're tired of it. We'll keep pushing forward." The following day, the police union held a press conference, defending the integrity of the force and criticizing Jane's proposed reforms as a threat to public safety. They argued that increased oversight and accountability would weaken officers' ability to perform and lead to a rise in crime. Media coverage reflected the city's division. Some outlets sided with the union, emphasizing the need to protect law and order, while others supported Jane's call for reform. Jane and Marcus held an emergency meeting with their strategy team to respond to the union's strong opposition. Marcus warned that the union was framing the situation as an us versus them narrative, aiming to pit them against law enforcement to stoke fear. Jane emphasized that the reforms were not an attack on the police, but on corruption and abuse of power. A team advisor suggested focusing on community engagement, highlighting the support from neighborhood groups and local leaders. Jane agreed, determined to organize more public meetings to involve citizens in the reform process. In the following weeks, Jane and her team worked tirelessly, holding community meetings across various neighborhoods. Citizens shared their experiences with law enforcement, with many expressing fear and distrust. Others voiced hope that Jane's reforms could bring about the change they had long awaited. Each story strengthened Jane's resolve. "This is why we can't back down," she told Marcus after an emotional meeting. Meanwhile, the police union intensified its campaign against the reforms. They launched TV ads warning of rising crime if the changes were implemented, and used their political influence to pressure city council members to withdraw support for the reform package. However, Jane wasn't without allies. Several council members, community leaders, and even former police officers publicly backed her cause. Media coverage began shifting, focusing on broader issues such as systemic racism and abuse of power within the police force, further fueling public demands for change. Jane knew this battle wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice and fairness. Through it all, Jane remained committed to ensuring that the police force served all citizens equitably. She understood that amplifying the voices of the community was key to achieving meaningful reform. As opposition from the police union grew, so did the movement, proving that this fight was about more than one person. It was about everyone's right to justice. Then, the day came when the city council would vote on Jane's reform package. The atmosphere was electric, with citizens gathering outside City Hall, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." The tension was palpable, as everyone knew the stakes of the vote. Inside the council chamber, Jane sat with Marcus, her heart pounding. She had done everything she could to prepare for this moment, but the outcome was still uncertain. The police union had put immense pressure on the council, and the vote would be close. As the council members began casting their votes, the chamber was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. One by one, the votes were read aloud, and the numbers were tight. Jane's hands clenched the arms of her chair, her eyes fixed on the council members as each vote was counted. Finally, the last vote was cast. The room held its breath as the council president read the final tally. It was a narrow victory. Jane's reform package had passed by a margin of just one vote. A wave of relief washed over Jane, but it was quickly followed by the realization that this was just the beginning. She had won the first battle, but the war for real, lasting change was far from over. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as the news spread. Jane and Marcus stepped out of City Hall to face the supporters who had gathered. Jane stood on the steps, looking out over the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude for the people who had stood by her throughout this difficult journey. She stepped forward and spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today, we took an important step forward in the fight for justice and accountability. This victory belongs to all of you. The people who stood up, who refused to be silenced, who demanded change." The crowd cheered, their voices united in a single, powerful message. "But this is not the end," Jane continued. "This is just the beginning. There are still many challenges ahead, and we must remain vigilant. The police force must rebuild its trust in the community, and we will hold them accountable every step of the way. Together, we will create a system that serves and protects everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from." As the crowd roared in approval, Jane felt a deep sense of purpose. She had won this battle, but she knew there was still much work to be done. The road to reform was long, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. Back in her office that evening, Jane sat down with Marcus, exhausted but filled with a sense of accomplishment. "We did it," Marcus said, smiling. Jane nodded. "We did, but the hard part is just beginning. We've passed the reforms, but now we have to make sure they're implemented properly. And that means constant pressure, constant vigilance." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a look of respect in his eyes. "You've started something bigger than any of us could have imagined, Jane. People are paying attention now. You've given them hope." Jane smiled, though her mind was already racing with thoughts of the next steps. "Hope is a powerful thing," she said softly, "but it's up to us to make sure that hope leads to real, lasting change." As the city moved forward with the reforms, Jane continued to fight for justice, knowing that every victory brought them one step closer to a future where power was no longer abused, and every citizen was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. And with each step, Jane Fonda knew she was making a difference. not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by a system that needed to change. In the days that followed, Jane Fonda's victory reverberated through the city. Her reform package had passed, and while the police union was still vocal in their opposition, it was clear that they had suffered a significant blow. Community leaders and activists were energized, and public support for the changes continued to grow. Jane knew, however, that passing the reforms was just one part of the battle. Implementation would be another story entirely. The police department, still influenced by the union, would likely resist at every turn. But Jane was determined to ensure that the changes were not just symbolic, but real, transformative actions that would alter the way the police operated in the city. One morning, as Jane sat in her office reviewing the new oversight committee, Marcus entered with a worried expression. "We have a problem," he said, handing her a stack of documents. It was a memo from the police department, indicating they were trying to adapt to reforms by creating loopholes and delays that could stall progress. "They're trying to undermine the reforms from within," Marcus said, frustrated. "If we don't act quickly, they'll render the committee useless." Jane leaned back in her chair, resolute. "I anticipated this. They won't give up easily. We need to act now." "We'll call for public involvement," Jane said, her gaze determined. "The fight can't happen behind closed doors. We will hold a press conference to expose their delaying tactics and rally the community once again." In the following days, Jane and her team worked tirelessly to prepare a response. They gathered evidence of the delaying tactics and organized meetings with community leaders to create momentum. The goal was clear: maintain pressure and ensure the reforms were implemented. The press conference was powerful. Jane stood at the podium alongside community leaders and activists. She began, "We have fought for these reforms because the people of this city deserve to see accountability from those who protect them. But it is clear that some elements within the police department are not interested in being held accountable." She paused to let the message resonate before continuing. "We demand transparency in the implementation of these reforms, and we will not allow any backroom deals to undermine the will of the people." Reporters immediately began to ask questions, but Jane kept her focus. The message was clear: the public needed to remain engaged, and the city required oversight of the police department. In the following days, media pressure intensified. Articles exposed the police department's efforts to obstruct the oversight process. Activists called for vigilance and urged the community to attend public meetings. Jane recognized that the growing pressure was precisely what was needed to maintain momentum. Meanwhile, tensions within the police department also heightened. Officers who had previously been indifferent now felt the weight of public scrutiny. The oversight committee was gradually taking shape, and its presence loomed throughout the department. The union continued to resist, but their solidarity began to crack. One day, Marcus burst into the office with an excited expression. "I think we have a breakthrough," he said. "An officer is willing to speak out about the internal resistance to the reforms." Jane's eyes lit up. If a few officers publicly support this, it could completely change the situation. Marcus agreed that it was risky for the officer, but if they could protect his identity until he was ready to go public, it could provide additional leverage. Jane smiled for the first time in days. "Set up a meeting with him. I want to hear what he has to say." The secret meeting with veteran police officer Rodriguez took place in a tense atmosphere. He shared, "I've served for 15 years and have seen many good officers leave because they can't stand the current management. The police department needs change, but the union has too much power. We're afraid to speak up because of the consequences." Jane listened attentively and replied, "Thank you for daring to speak out. We can protect you, but we need your help to build a case. If more officers support us, the union will find it harder to suppress the truth." Rodriguez agreed, and in the following weeks, they gathered testimonies from other officers who also supported reform but feared retaliation. Gradually, they built a network of allies within the department. With new information, Jane's team launched a public campaign highlighting the voices of those supporting reform. Anonymous quotes from Rodriguez and his colleagues appeared in the media, painting a picture of a police force divided between those wanting progress and those clinging to the old ways. The public response was strong. People began to realize that not all police officers opposed reform, and that many within the force wanted to rebuild trust with the community, putting pressure on the union. One evening, as Jane and Marcus sat in the office going over their strategy, Marcus smiled and said, "I think we've turned the tide. This feels different now." Jane nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It does, but we can't let up. We have to keep pushing until these reforms are fully in place, and the culture inside the department begins to change for real." As the months passed, the Oversight Committee became fully operational, and officers like Rodriguez continued to provide valuable insight into the inner workings of the police department. Slowly but surely, the reforms began to take hold. The union's influence waned, and more officers came forward, eager to see a department that truly served the people. The road was long, and there were still challenges ahead, but Jane Fonda had accomplished what many thought impossible. She had not only passed sweeping reforms, but she had also begun to change the very culture of the city's police force. The journey was far from over, but Jane knew that with the support of the people and the growing momentum for justice, lasting change was finally within reach. As she looked out over the city one evening, the lights flickering in the distance, Jane felt a deep sense of hope. The fight had been hard, but it was worth it. And as long as people were willing to stand up and demand accountability, there would always be a path forward toward a better future. In the following months, under Jane Fonda's leadership, the city saw significant improvements. The Oversight Committee began conducting regular reviews of police conduct, leading to a substantial reduction in concealed complaints. Officers like Rodriguez, who previously feared retaliation, now felt empowered to speak out. A new sense of accountability was established, holding violating officers legally responsible. While the reforms were not perfect, they were gradually proving effective. The community felt their voices were being heard, and trust in local governance began to rebuild. Jane regularly hosted meetings to understand residents' concerns, helping her stay connected with the community. However, opposition forces continued their efforts to obstruct the changes. One day, as Jane was reviewing the committee's report, Marcus, her close associate, handed her a stack of documents. It was a lawsuit filed by the police union, alleging that the reforms violated contractual rights and endangered officers' safety. This was the latest attempt to halt the progress Jane had achieved. Jane realized the battle was far from over. The union had hired one of the state's top law firms to strengthen the lawsuit. However, she was determined not to let this derail their efforts. "They lost the public's support, so now they're turning to the courts," Jane said. "But we can't let them slow us down." Marcus stressed the need to prepare a strong legal strategy, warning that if the court sided with the union, all progress could be undone. Jane agreed and added, "We won't just play defense. We'll take this issue to the public. They need to understand that if we lose, it won't just be a defeat for reform. It will be a defeat for justice." In the following weeks, Jane and her team worked tirelessly to prepare for the legal battle. They held press conferences, clearly explaining the risks the lawsuit posed. Public support quickly grew in Jane's favor, as people realized this was not just a political struggle, but a fight for the right to live in a city where everyone is equal under the law. As the case went to court, the city became a battleground. The union's lawyers argued that the reforms infringed on the rights of officers and endangered their ability to do their jobs. But Jane's legal team, led by a brilliant attorney named Linda Brooks, countered that the reforms were necessary to protect the rights of all citizens and ensure that the police were held to the highest standards of accountability. The trial was highly publicized, with every day's proceedings covered in the news. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No more corruption." Inside, the tension was palpable. Both sides knew that the outcome of this case would set a precedent, not just for this city, but for police reform efforts across the country. Throughout the trial, Jane remained calm and composed, but the weight of the situation was undeniable. This was one of the toughest fights of her career, and she knew that the stakes couldn't be higher. If the court ruled in favor of the police union, it could dismantle everything she had fought for. One afternoon, as the trial neared its conclusion, Jane and Marcus sat together in her office, reflecting on the journey they had taken to get here. "We've come so far," Marcus said quietly. "No matter what happens in court, you've changed this city, Jane. You've made people believe in justice again." Jane smiled, but her eyes were tired. "We have changed things, Marcus. But if we lose this case, it could set us back years. We can't afford to let that happen. Marcus nodded, understanding the pressure she was feeling. I know, but win or lose, you've inspired people. They won't forget that. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. Both sides presented their closing arguments, and then it was time to wait for the judge's decision. The next few days were agonizing. Jane continued her work at City Hall, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on her. She knew that this was out of her hands now. It was up to the court to decide the future of her reforms. Finally, the day came when the ruling was announced. Jane, Marcus, and their team gathered in the courtroom, their hearts pounding as the judge entered. The room was silent as the judge began to read the verdict. After what felt like an eternity, the words Jane had been hoping for were spoken. The court finds in favor of the city. A wave of relief washed over Jane as she realized what it meant. The reforms would continue to be implemented. The police union had lost the legal battle, and the city could move forward with the changes that had already begun reshaping the police department. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered with joy. Jane and Marcus stepped out to face the supporters who had gathered, their faces full of happiness and hope. Jane stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd that had stood by her throughout this long battle. "We did it," Jane said, her voice filled with emotion. "Today, justice has prevailed. But this victory belongs to all of you. You stood up for what was right, and thanks to your courage, our city is one step closer to becoming a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd roared, their voices united in a powerful, celebratory message. But Jane knew this wasn't the end. There was still much work to be done, and the road ahead would not be easy. Yet for the first time in a long while, she felt that real change was within reach. As she stood there, surrounded by the people she had fought to protect, Jane felt a renewed sense of purpose. The police union's lawsuit had been a test of everything she believed in, and she had won. But more importantly, she had shown that when people come together to demand justice, nothing could stop them. That evening at City Hall, Jane and Marcus sat together, reflecting on the journey they had taken. "This feels like a turning point," Marcus said. "We've won the legal battle, and the reforms are starting to take hold." Jane nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Yes, this is a turning point, but we can't let up. We've seen what happens when those in power aren't held accountable. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting." Marcus smiled. "And we will. You've inspired the whole city, Jane. This is just the beginning." Jane looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the night. She knew Marcus was right. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice and equality would continue, but she was ready. With the support of the people and a newfound hope, Jane Fonda was prepared to lead her city into a new era, one where accountability, transparency, and justice were not just words, but realities. And as the city began to heal and rebuild, Jane knew that the future was bright. Together, they had proven that real change was possible, and together, they would keep fighting for a better tomorrow. As Jane Fonda sat in her office, gazing out the large windows overlooking the city, her thoughts were filled with both satisfaction and determination. The recent legal victory had been monumental, not just for her, but for the entire city. It was proof that change was possible, even in the face of powerful resistance. Yet, Jane knew that this was just the beginning. The road to meaningful reform was long and filled with challenges ahead. The city had begun to shift. People were more engaged and more aware of the systemic issues that had long plagued the police department. The reforms were starting to take root, and for the first time in years, the community felt hopeful. But Jane also understood that real, lasting change didn't come overnight. The police union's legal battle may have been lost, but their influence remained strong. The culture within the police department still had a long way to go before it could be fully transformed. As she leaned back in her chair, her mind drifted to the stories she had heard during the town halls, stories of everyday citizens who had been mistreated, marginalized, and ignored for too long. Those voices echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve to keep pushing forward. The reforms were a victory for those people, but Jane knew she had to remain vigilant to ensure that their voices continued to be heard. The city's police oversight committee was now fully operational, but Jane had seen how easily bureaucratic systems could be slowed or corrupted. She made it a priority to stay closely involved, regularly meeting with the committee to monitor their progress and ensure transparency. Every officer who violated the trust of the community needed to be held accountable, and Jane would not allow the committee to become complacent. One evening, as the sun set over the skyline, casting a golden hue across her office, Marcus entered with a stack of reports. "We're making progress," Marcus said, his tone cautiously optimistic. "Complaints about police misconduct are being taken seriously, and we've already seen some officers face disciplinary action. It's a start." Jane nodded, glancing over the reports. "It's good news, but we can't stop here. This can't just be about discipline. It has to be about changing the culture. We need to focus on training, on building trust between the police and the community." Marcus agreed. There's a lot of work to be done, but the fact that people are starting to feel empowered to speak out is a huge step forward. The community is watching, and the pressure is on. Jane smiled slightly. "That's exactly what we need. As long as the public remains engaged, we have a chance to keep this momentum going." Looking out the window, Jane reminded herself that while the road ahead was still long, she was ready to continue leading this effort for change. She had no illusions about the challenges that remained, but she also did not doubt that progress was being made. The city was moving in the right direction, and she would make sure it stayed that way. This story highlights how deep-seated biases can have severe consequences, even when they target a mayor. Jane's determination to seek justice underscores the need for police reform. Do you think these reforms will truly make a difference? If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.